Hi, welcome to my comprehensive Durin guide. Durin is the new Pyro sword wielder released in version 6.2 or Luna 3. This dragon is a jack of all trades that can fulfill basically any role you want to build him for, whether it's as a carry, sub DPS, or support, oftentimes fulfilling multiple roles at once. Honestly, the amount of damage and buffing he provides with so little effort almost feels a little unfair in the best way possible. So now, let's see how to train our Durin. Starting off with his normal attack, Durin performs a 4-hit combo and his charge attack is pretty standard as well. Next, Durin's elemental skill causes him to undergo essential transmutation. Basically what this means is that when you first tap his skill, Durin will enter a state where you pick between two forms, White Dragon form and Dark Dragon form. Durin will then transform into whatever you choose and deal some damage. And lastly, he also restores a massive amount of energy for himself, so he's like his own battery. And here's how you choose a form. After pressing his skill initially, if you press his skill again, he enters White Dragon form, and if you press normal attack, he will enter Dark Dragon form. Now this doesn't seem to do anything on its own right now, but I'll explain what it affects when we talk about his elemental burst and passives. So basically, you press skill and then pick a state. If you press skill again, it's White form, and if you press normal attack, then he goes Dark form. An extra piece of info is that Durin will start off in White form. Moving on to his elemental burst, his burst has two different versions depending on whether Durin is in White or Dark form. In his White form, Durin deals some pyro damage and then he will continuously target and deal AoE damage to nearby enemies each second. Alternatively, in his Dark form, Durin also deals a bit of pyro damage, but instead of dealing AoE damage, Durin will fire out a single target homing attack instead, no aiming necessary. This happens every 1.25 seconds compared to the 1 second interval that his White form AoE has. Now despite the slower attacks in his Dark form, these attacks do have higher multipliers, which means that both forms will have basically the same scaling, so there is no inherently better form. Which form you choose will be based on the team comp and enemies that you're going up against. I also want to mention that Durin's burst has a 70 energy cost, which might lead one to believe that he needs to build a lot of energy. However, at talent level 10, his skill restores 33 energy upon use, meaning that his elemental burst actually has an effective cost of 37, so his energy needs are in reality quite low. Another thing to note about his burst is that it has a 20-second duration and an 18-second cooldown. So this is basically going to be the first time we have a pyro character that is able to maintain essentially 100% uptime on their elemental application, and also without needing to worry about energy like some other characters. This is incredibly rare and honestly the first of its kind, and I just wanted to take a little moment to gush about his burst because I'm a big fan of characters with high uptime and low maintenance, and I'm just really excited about his kit. Okay, now moving on, Durin's first passive, Light Manifest of the Divine Calculus. Basically, when he's in his White form or his more supportive form, and you trigger any pyro-related reaction, excluding Vaporize and Melt, this will decrease the enemy's elemental resistance to pyro and the corresponding element involved in a reaction by 20% for 6 seconds. So this means that if you trigger Overload, he will shred the enemy resistance for pyro and electro by 20%. If you have Pyro Swirl, then pyro and animal resistance. If you have Pyro Crystallize, then pyro and geo. And lastly, if you have Burning, then pyro and dendro. One thing to note is that for the burning effect, you can trigger this passive just by dealing pyro or dendro damage to them, so you won't have to worry about removing burning and reapplying the effect. Vaporize and Melt are not included in this passive, meaning that Durin cannot shred cryo or hydro resistances. Once again, Durin will not be able to help your cryo or hydro DPS with this passive, so keep that in mind. Now, if these values and what I'm about to mention next don't sound that impressive, just stay with me, because his other passive will make these a lot better. For his second version, if you're in his Dark form, you can think of this as his reaction DPS form for simplicity's sake. In this form, Vaporize and Melt damage are both increased by 40% for Durin. So if you intend to play Durin as a carry in a team where he does Vaporize or Melt reactions off Hydro or Cryo respectively, then you can lean toward Dark form. Otherwise, White form will be your go-to in all other situations. Next, his second passive, Chaos formed like the Night. Basically, Durin will gain 10 stacks that increases elemental burst damage, with each attack consuming 1 stack for up to 10 boosted hits. Stacks will refresh every time he casts his elemental burst. For every 100 attack that Durin has, the stacks will increase his burst damage by 3% up to 75%. This means that to max out this passive's buff effect, you will need 2500 attack on him. The damage increase is very potent, so you want to make sure that you keep this number in mind when you're building him. And his third passive is Witch's Eve Rite, Ode to Ascension. This is the Hexen Circle or Hexarray buffs introduced with his release. When you have 2 Hexarray characters in the party, meaning Durin plus 1 other member, then this passive will activate. This passive increases his earlier first passive's effects by 75%, not including the duration. Meaning that with this passive unlocked, Durin will now shred resistances by 35% in white form, and he will gain 70% vaporize and melt damage while in dark form. This is a very significant increase, so you're usually going to want to pair him with another Hexarray when building your teams. And he has an extra passive that grants you 25% more rewards when dispatched on Mondstadt 20-hour expeditions. Pretty standard stuff. So with all this in mind, here is the general idea of the form you use in a team. If Durin is dealing significant vape or melt damage, then use dark form. In all other scenarios, you can stick to his white form. For his talent leveling priority, you will want to prioritize his burst, since nearly all of his damage will be coming from burst damage. Next, you can max his skill if you'd like, and then you can ignore his normal attacks altogether except in one scenario. If you plan to play Durin on field and utilize his normal attacks, then you would level that as well. It is a fairly niche playstyle and would involve bringing along a different party member to provide infusion for him, since Durin doesn't have any sources of infusion on his own kit. While we're on that topic, now that we have a good idea of what his kit does, let's talk about different ways to play him. Generally, for most people, Durin's playstyle will be that of a quick swap sub DPS support. This means that essentially you'll swap into him, press his skill, choose white form, and then press burst, and then swap off. And that's basically it. He'll continuously deal damage from off-field and shred resistances, and you won't have to think about much from there. One thing to keep in mind is that even though you're already in white form, you'll still want to use his skill for the massive energy regen it provides, which will help top you up before bursting again. This playstyle will work perfectly fine in an overload team, burning team, geo team, animal DPS team, and even mono pyro. And in a mono pyro team, make sure to bring a different element so that you can react off of it, because Durin Shred doesn't activate without reactions. Alternatively, if you plan to play main DPS Durin, then you'll likely play him in his dark form in a vape or melt team. This means that you'll have other teammates in the party apply hydro or cryo, and then you'll react Durin's dark form burst damage off of that. In some of these cases, the teammate applying hydro or cryo may have to be on field to make sure that there is enough application though. And you might be wondering, if he can do both, which one is he better suited for then? But in fact, Durin performs at the top for many teams for both support and DPS playstyles, so you really can't go wrong. I'll also mention that if you decide to play Durin on field, then you'll be utilizing his normal attacks for additional damage as well. In these scenarios, you would basically be using C6 Bennett to infuse Durin with Pyro. This would allow Durin to contribute a good additional portion of damage from his own normal attack hits. Moving on, now let's talk about his weapon options, starting with his signature weapon, which is his best option as one would expect. It has high crit rate on his secondary stat. Additionally, its passive increases elemental burst crit damage by 16%, which is perfect for Durin. Also, when a burst hits an enemy, the wearer gains an additional 20% attack, and nearby active party members, not including the equipping character, gain a 16% attack buff for 3 seconds. This uptime is relatively low, but because Durin's burst hits every 1 or 1.25 seconds depending on your team, this will be no issue for him. And if you have the Hexarray buff passive, then these are increased by 75%, meaning that Durin will actually gain 35% attack, as well as providing the active party member excluding himself 28% attack. This means that a significant portion of his weapon stats will require you to build teams around having a Hexarray member with him, so keep that in mind. If you aren't planning on getting the signature, many of the other 5-star swords will work perfectly fine with him, honestly performing pretty close. Starting off, if you want Durin to be more focused on supporting the party, you can slot him with Freedom Sworn, as it gives him a bit of damage percent. It also provides the party with normal, charged, and plunging attack damage, as well as a nice attack buff to top it off. Overall, if you're playing Durin mostly for his support capabilities, this is going to be a great option. If you plan to play Durin as a main DPS and you have Mist Splitter, then that is also something to consider. This weapon provides a huge amount of crit rate as well as a 12% elemental damage bonus, which can be increased up to 40% with its passive effect. Keep in mind though that one of the requirements to gain an emblem for Mist Splitter's passive is that you have to deal elemental damage with your normal attack, meaning that without elemental infusion from someone like Bennett, Durin cannot gain all 3 stacks. Primordial Jade Cutter can also work quite well if you happen to have it, as it provides a massive 44% crit rate substat, as well as providing an attack bonus based off his max HP, which Durin will very much appreciate both because he is an attack scaler and also his own passive which scales off his own attack. Other good options for limited 5-star weapons if you happen to have them include Absolution, Azure Light, Light of Foliar Incision, and so on. Although they aren't quite made for him, their secondary crit stats are really good and Durin can still make partial use of their passives. Moving on to 4-star and free-to-play options, the Battle Pass weapon Wolffang is a great option that synergizes exceptionally well with his burst focus kit. It provides a significant amount of crit rate from a secondary stat. Additionally, its passive grants another 16% elemental burst damage and a stacking crit rate buff for his burst up to 8% at R1. Next up, you can also consider running Lion's Roar on him, which comes from Wishing. Because of Durin's passive, the value of having an attack secondary substat is a lot higher on him than other DPS, so he appreciates this weapon quite a bit. Additionally, its passive increases damage dealt to enemies affected by Pyro or Electro by 20% and up to 36% at R5. For Durin, being a Pyro character with consistent elemental application from his burst, this condition will be very easy to meet. For a free-to-play craftable option, Finale of the Deep is a strong competitor with the other 4-star weapons mentioned. This weapon also provides attack percent as its secondary, and its passive also grants another 12% attack upon using your elemental skill. Additionally, you'll also gain Bond of Life, which when cleared will provide even more attack, scaling up to a maximum of 150 for 15 seconds, which is very high uptime, covering a majority of Durin's burst duration. At R5, these values go up to 24% attack plus a maximum additional flat attack of 300 for 15 seconds. Overall, these options are all quite good, so feel free to use whichever you have available to you. I do recommend sticking to these options and not trying to go for any 3-star weapons. Because Durin scales very well with attack compared to other characters, the loss of attack by using a 3-star weapon makes them not worth it. Alright, moving forward, let's talk about Durin's artifact options, and he has a lot of options. Before we talk about them though, I do want to mention that none of these artifacts feel particularly tailor-made for Durin, and it has been a while since we've had a new artifact set released. So I do expect that a new set might be released in the near future, and one of those sets could possibly become his best in slot over all these options I'm about to talk about. Basically, what I'm saying is, you should use whatever artifacts you have that fit these recommendations. However, I wouldn't recommend going out of your way to farm for better pieces at the moment. Hold off on it for now in case there is something better on the horizon. With that out of the way, let's actually get into his artifacts. Starting off, the number one generalist set you will go for is the 4-piece Noblesse Oblige. This is one of the only sets where Durin can utilize both the 2-piece and 4-piece effects. The elemental burst damage is very useful since that's going to be most of his damage, and the party-wide attack buff supports his team, and Durin himself can also make good use of it. That being said, this set is already heavily contested by other support characters like Bennett, so if you already have someone holding Noblesse in the party, then here are some other alternatives that are surprisingly very flexible. You can basically mix and match any 2-piece sets of either 2-piece Noblesse for the elemental burst damage, 2-piece pyro damage, and any 2-piece attack percent set. They'll all basically perform well here and are competitive with each other, so use whichever sets you have the better substats on. You can also use 4-piece Emblem if you have a good set, but I wouldn't place this higher than the other 2-piece combinations mentioned before. Because you won't be building very much ER to begin with on Durin, and because the burst bonus effect from the 4-piece is based on your total ER, Durin actually won't really be able to benefit as much, so I wouldn't go out of my way to farm this now. But if you already have a good set for him from beforehand, then feel free to use this. If you are running Durin on field and you specifically are going to be using Farina as well, then you can put Marechaussee Hunter on Durin, since Farina will allow him to trigger the 4-piece effect. There are other sets as well you can put him on in more specialized teams like Unfinished Reverie in a Burning team, as well as Flower of Paradise Lost or Gilded Dreams in a Burgeon team, but these will be situational. Now let's talk about main and substats for Durin, which are fairly straightforward. For general use, whether you are playing him in white or dark form, you will want to go with the standard DPS main stats. So that means attack percent for Sands, pyro damage for Goblet, and crit rate or crit damage for your Circlet. However, if you find that your attack is falling significantly below 2500, say around 2000 or below, you can opt for an attack percent Goblet instead. Basically, if your total attack with the Goblet will add up to be less than 2500, you can use an attack or pyro Goblet, whichever you have better substats for. In certain situations when playing as dark form, you could also opt to run EM Sands as well, but attack percent will generally be your default option. If you are playing him in a Burgeon team, however, you will of course want to run him with triple EM main stats to maximize his Burgeon damage, as he will be the one triggering the Dendro cores in these situations. Now moving on to substats, you'll want to look for crit rate and crit damage substats as well as attack percent. Due to Durin's scaling, rolls into attack percent will have decently competitive value with crit substats. Lastly, you can also grab extra EM if you're playing him in dark form and doing reactions, as well as just a small amount of ER here and there to make his rotation more comfortable. As for his exact ER requirements, I did mention that his skill refunds him a massive amount of energy, so his energy requirements are not as high as you would think. I would recommend about 30 to 50% ER just to be safe, but this is if he's working as the sole pyro on the team. If you have an additional pyro teammate or just Favonius weapon procs, this amount will of course be even lower. At the end of the day, these numbers are just baseline references, and you should try them out on the teams that you end up playing and tune his ER from there. And depending on the content you're doing, the exact amount can change as well. For example, if you're bringing him into Stygian where you will be starting with no energy, you may want to bring a bit extra in those specific cases. Finally, let's talk about his teammates and team compositions, because Durin is a character with no shortage of options when it comes to team building, being able to fit himself into more parties than seems fair. First, in most cases, you'll want to pair him with another Hexray character to unlock his full potential. This is even more true if you're using his signature weapon. All of them do work with Durin to some extent, but some common options to pair him with include Fischl, Mona, Albedo, and Sucrose. Again, this is not to say that the other characters don't work or that these are the only teams I recommend, but because of Durin's varied options, we'll be talking more about the commonly used and accessible Hexray characters. Starting off, let's talk about Durin and Fischl, which will be the foundation for Pyro and Overload teams, and is likely where he'll see a lot of popularity. In Overload compositions, you'll generally start with these two characters, and then round them out with another buffer or support such as Bennett, Chevreuse, or Iansan, and then the last slot would be your main DPS, either being Electro or Pyro such as Arlecchino, Chlorand, Mavuika, Raiden, Klee and Razor with their buffs, and so on. You can mix and match these last two slots as you need, so for example, some teams can be Arlecchino, Durin, Fischl, and Bennett, being a very potent combo, or Chlorand, Durin, Fischl, and Chevreuse works too, or Veressa, Durin, Fischl, Iansan, or Raiden, Durin, Fischl, and Chevreuse, and so on. Note that Chevreuse is not mandatory in these teams if you wish to use someone else, because Durin Shred allows him to essentially function in place of Chevreuse. If you want to play Durin as the main source of damage in Overload comps, you can feel free to remove the main DPS in the examples before and slot in another support. So you can run Durin, Fischl, Bennett, and then either Iansan or Chevreuse. You can also run Durin in a Pyro team with Linny, pairing him with Fischl and Chevreuse as well. Also, I do want to mention that just because the Hexarray pairing buffs are very strong, this doesn't necessarily mean that you will always have to run him with another Hexarray unit. It just means that it is generally the best way to maximize his own contributions in the team. An example of a team comp that you might run that doesn't involve a second Hexarray would be something like Veressa, Durin, Iansan, Chevreuse, where the supportive capabilities of Iansan and Chevreuse are just so strong that it makes up for it. Remember though that you will lose Durin's full passive effect, and if you're running him with his signature weapon, then you will be foregoing value from his weapon passive as well. Sometimes though it may turn out to work better overall if the team just doesn't pair well with any Hexarray character. Moving on, you can also slot Durin into a Kinich team. Durin provides Kinich with a source of Dendro Shred, as well as consistent pyro application and damage to maintain the burning aura. So this would look something like Durin with Iansan to support and buff, followed by Emily and Kinich as your main DPS. Or alternatively, you can also run Durin, Albedo, Iansan, and Kinich with Albedo replacing Emily. Or if you're focusing more on boosting Kinich here, you can run Kinich, Durin, Bennett, and Iansan. You can see I'm breaking my own guideline here again, but like I said, sometimes you can forgo building around the Hexarray pair buff if the synergy isn't as strong. Of course, in the future, there may be new witch characters introduced that fill in these niches though. Chaska teams are also another that will greatly benefit from Durin. Chaska deals multi-elemental damage, and she's always struggled somewhat to shred the elemental res of all the elements without sacrificing her own personal DPS. However, with Durin, he can provide the res shred without forcing Chaska to sacrifice an elemental bullet. So these teams could look something like Chaska, Durin, Fischl, and Iansan. Chaska is honestly quite flexible for the remaining two slots, so feel free to run anything else here like Chaska, Durin, Inefa, Farina, and so on. I haven't mentioned this yet, but Durin works very well with pure animal DPS teams too, because he is one of the very few sources of animal res shredding in the game. So you can feel free to play him in comps with Xiao, Wanderer, and Venti, who has also been buffed and can now work as the main DPS. Teams like this will look like the main DPS, Durin, generally Faruzan for buffs, and then you can fill in the last slot. So you can run something like Wanderer, Durin, Faruzan, and Venti, which can work very well together, or Xiao, Durin, Albedo, and Faruzan, or even Venti, Durin, Faruzan, and Bennett. Moving on, let's talk about teams that focus more on Durin's DPS. In these teams, I'll generally be focusing on Vape or Melt reactions to take advantage of his Dark Form passive, but keep in mind this is going to be single target, so in some AoE scenarios, you may still end up using White Form to deal more damage. These teams will focus on using Mona as his Hexarray pair. Since these comps will be focused on amplifying Durin's damage with Vapes, Mona ends up being the usual go-to choice. This is because Mona has also received buffs with Durin's release, and she has now become a very potent Hydro applier and damage buffer through her passives and her burst's Omen effect. Do keep in mind that some of Mona's new buffs are locked behind some of her constellations. In these teams, you would generally run double Hydro, so that would look something like Durin, Mona, Farina, and Bennett, with Farina to provide additional Hydro application, damage, and buffing, while also enabling Marechaussee Hunter if you're running that, and Bennett who will be providing his usual massive attack boost from his burst, as well as a Pyro infusion if you have him at C6. You can also run him in a Melt team since his passive does boost his Melt reaction damage as well, with Citlali being the best enabler by far here, paired with Shalonen and a Flex for your last spot. Maybe another Cryo so that Durin can melt more consistently, an Animo character like Sucrose for VV, EM buffs and being able to hold Thrilling Tales, or even someone like Bennett for the Pyro Resonance and buffs. Basically, if you're familiar with Mavuika or Arlecchino melt teams, it's a similar concept to those. Lastly, I want to make an honorable mention for Durin Burgeon teams that I kind of hinted a bit on. Burgeon has honestly never had that great of a reputation, especially compared to Hyperbloom. But with Durin's release, he actually now is the best Burgeon character in the game. Because of his large AoE and his White Form, high uptime, and basically zero ER requirements, you can comfortably stack EM without worrying about ER or anything else. Keep in mind that Dendro reaction teams generally have been struggling to keep up with more modern teams now, so Lauma is strongly recommended in these comps as she does boost damage up to be very competitive. So these teams would look like Durin, Lauma, Mona, and fill in the last slot with something like Xingqiu or Yelan. Neuvillette also works incredibly well here if you're a Neuvillette player and familiar with his Hyperbloom teams. This is basically that, but with Burgeon instead. So that would be Durin, Lauma, Farina, and Neuvillette. Alright, and here's just a bit of gameplay as a demonstration of what these Durin teams would look like in practice.
Teamwork is
And so these are just some examples of teams you can run, and just things to keep in mind when building your roster around him. I really want to stress that it would be unrealistic for me to talk about every single team, and this is definitely not an exhaustive list of every possibility. So just because a certain composition that you're interested in running wasn't mentioned doesn't mean that it's not viable. In fact, it probably is, because he's just that universally good. Durin is extremely versatile, and you can make him shine in so many more teams than I'm able to show here. The list of teams for Durin really does go on, and it might even be easier to talk about teams that he doesn't work in at this point. Lastly, let's take a look at Durin's constellations and what I recommend in terms of vertical investment if you are planning on pulling for his weapon and or constellations. Starting with his C1, when Durin uses his elemental burst, he will gain 20 stacks that are consumed to increase damage dealt. If you're familiar with Shenhe's quill mechanics, it's basically that. While in white form, when other party members deal normal attack, charge attack, plunging attack, elemental skill, or elemental burst damage, basically dealing any sort of damage whatsoever, 1 stack will be consumed to increase the damage dealt by 60% of Durin's attack. It's basically free damage for your party. Alternatively, if Durin is in his dark form, then whenever Durin deals damage with his burst, 2 stacks will be consumed to increase its damage dealt by 150% of his attack, so essentially for 10 hits. Overall, this is a pretty decent increase in his party's DPS or his own burst damage depending on which form you're in. For C2, after Durin uses his burst, whenever anyone in your party triggers any Vaporize, Melt, Burning, Overload, Pyroswirl, and Pyrocrystallize reaction, basically whenever you trigger any pyro reaction whatsoever, Vaporize and Melt included, Durin will grant the entire party a 50% pyro damage bonus and a 50% elemental damage bonus of the other element involved for 6 seconds. Remember the earlier passive where whenever a reaction was triggered, Durin would shred the resistances for 2 elements? Yeah, this is basically adding on to that. So in addition to the res shred, your party gains a hefty 50% damage bonus. Keep in mind that unlike his resistance shredding, which could not interact with cryo or hydro, this effect does include those elements. This is very, very nice, and again, a huge party damage increase basically just for playing your Durin as you would anyway. His C3 increases his bursts by 3 levels, which offers a modest increase in his personal damage as nearly all of his damage is from his burst. Next, his C4 increases his burst damage by 40%, just unconditionally, no strings attached. Also, when you're using stacks from a C1, there is a 30% chance that no stacks will be consumed, meaning that Durin will be able to maintain his C1 quills for that much longer. C5 increases elemental skill by 3, which is not that impressive honestly. And then lastly, C6. His C6 is a very strong and impressive capstone to finish off on if you plan to max him out. Starting off, his elemental burst will now ignore 30% of enemies' defense. This is also unconditional and just permanently in effect. Next, depending on which form you're in, there are also additional effects. While Durin is in his white form, enemies hit by his burst will also have their defense decreased by 30% for 6 seconds. And if he's in his dark form, his burst will ignore an additional 40% of all enemies' defense for a staggering 70% defense ignore in this mode. Both these effects are very, very strong as you would expect from a C6. Not only are defense shred and ignore both very potent boosts to your damage, these are also rare to find in a character's kit, especially defense shredding, which is different from elemental resistance. Defense reducing abilities are much less common and basically only found in character constellations in rare instances. And so basically any team you slot him in will greatly appreciate this if you do decide to go for this one. Now, I want to take a moment just to talk about constellation values and priority for those that intend to invest vertically into Durin but aren't quite sure whether to pull for his weapon or some of his early constellations. From a pure damage perspective, you will likely get more value going for a C1 and then a C2 before finally going for his weapon, because while Durin's signature weapon is very good on him, he also has a lot of very competitive options in both 5 stars and 4-star weapons, where sometimes his signature really isn't that big of a leap in damage gain. In addition, a significant portion of his weapon's power is locked behind having the Hexray buff active. Of course, if you want his weapon purely for aesthetics, that's perfectly fine too, because either way, whether you're going for constellations or his weapon, you will see a good increase in performance. Alright, and that covers basically everything about Durin. I hope you enjoyed this guide and found it useful. And whether you're planning to pull for him or not, I hope you have a better understanding of Durin now. Give me a like if you enjoyed the video. If you are pulling for him, let me know. And also let me know who you're running him with if you are. And I'm honestly having a lot of fun with him and just want to share the energy too. Alright, thank you. Take care.